going to begin a new study tonight on the history of the period between the Old and New Testaments. And if you would like a resource to add to your library to kind of follow along, I'm going to be working loosely off of this book, The 400 Silent Years by H.A. Ironside. I checked it out on Amazon just before class, and it's selling in paperback for $5.99 on Amazon right now. So if you want to get that and add to your library, you can. I believe they also offer a Kindle version and an audiobook version. So if you're interested, you're more than welcome to get that. I'm not going to follow this to the letter, but it'll give us a structure. I suppose the thing that commended this book to me for this class is that I think it takes some fairly tangled history and makes it pretty accessible in a not too terribly overwhelming way, because this history in this period can get a bit overwhelming if you dive in too deeply. And another thing that might be helpful to you, Ironside takes somewhat of a devotional approach to the study of this period of history. In other words, as he relates the story to you, periodically he tries to draw lessons from the things that are going on and make applications. And that might be helpful to you also as a way of making this study more meaningful to you. So I'd recommend this book to you. There are a number of other really good reference works, and we'll reference those as we go along. Tonight I thought it might be helpful just to begin with a broad overview of the history of the period, and then we'll dive in a little bit deeper in our following weeks into period by period and look at them in more depth. But I think sometimes it helps to start with a view from 30,000 feet, and then as we zoom in, maybe you have a little more context to place the individual episodes into. So let's think together for just a moment about where we start our biblical history. Of course, in the Garden of Eden, as God creates man, and it isn't very long until man becomes very wicked in the succeeding generations after Adam and Eve. And so we have the flood in Genesis chapter 6, and then after the flood is really when our history begins. I mean, you think about this, we don't know exactly how many years elapsed between creation and Abraham, for example. All right? We meet Abraham at the end of Genesis chapter 11. But it's probably fair to say, from what we know of history outside the Bible, and combining that from the history that is related for us in those 11 chapters of the Bible, to say that there's a pretty immense chunk of human history that's covered in those 11 chapters in a pretty summary fashion. Once we step into Abraham's world at the end of Genesis chapter 11, and of course most memorably at the beginning of chapter 12, we're stepping into what we might call datable history. History that we can, with comparison with things that we have outside the Bible, sort of place into a datable historical context and working that way forward. So we begin to talk about Abraham. Well, of course, God calls Abraham to leave his father's house and to go to a place that he will show him, which ends up being Palestine. And there he says that he will make his name great. He will make of him a great nation. He will bless those who bless him, curse those who curse him. And we find that eventually, through the promise of God, Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac, of course, becomes the father of two sons, Jacob and Esau. Now, you say, this is extremely remote history to what you're going to talk about. It is and it's not. Esau's descendants will have an incredibly pivotal role down toward the end of our study. Because when we get down to the period where the Romans begin to take charge in Palestine, one of the first people that they place in a position of authority under the umbrella of Roman authority is a fellow by the name of Herod, who is described as an Idumean. Anybody know what an Idumean is? Well, we know them in the Old Testament as Edomites. Who are Edomites? Descendants of Esau. Yeah, Edom was another name for Esau. And so Herod, the Herod that we read about who's on the throne when Jesus is born, is a descendant of Esau, which means that he is from that nation that is essentially first cousins to the Israelites. The Israelites descending from Jacob, the Edomites descending from Esau, brothers, right? So first cousin nations, and first cousin nations that were pretty much always at some level of animosity toward one another throughout their history. Okay? So Jacob and Esau, all right? Jacob has 12 sons. The 12 sons become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, they're not really a nation as such until the time of Moses. Well, that follows 400, give or take, years of Egyptian captivity when God raises up Moses to lead his people out of Egyptian captivity. And interestingly enough, even though he has promised, number one, to give to Abraham's descendants the land of Palestine, and number two, to Moses to give that land to the children of Israel, whom Moses is going to lead out, rather than leading them by the well-worn travel or trade pathway right along the northern coast of the Sinai Peninsula that leads right into Palestine, God takes them south down into the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. And I think that's incredibly interesting. And I think part of the reason for that is if you read carefully the account of the children of Israel between leaving Egypt and arriving at Mount Sinai, you really are not reading about a nation. What you're reading about is a straggling bunch of refugees. And they are disorganized, and they have this slave mindset that they have not worked their way out of yet. They don't have any central point of unity and allegiance yet. All they are is glad to be out of Egypt for the moment, until they get hungry or thirsty, and then they want to go back to Egypt, right? They get to Mount Sinai, and God does several things for them. Number one, he establishes an order for them. He establishes an order for them to pitch their camps in a certain way. He establishes a law for them to govern their not only their relationship with God, but their civil relationships among one another. He establishes a religion whereby he sets up the tabernacle and the worship under the Mosaic system. He establishes a priesthood. He establishes a marching order so that when they leave Mount Sinai, they will have an organization as a military body to march toward conquest. And then finally, after about a year at Mount Sinai of organizing and establishing and welding them into a nation, he leads them out. And if they had lost the refugee mindset while they were at Mount Sinai, I would argue that they would have marched straight up to Kadesh Barnea, set up a headquarters, and from there launched their assault on the land of Canaan and would have taken it. But you know the story. They stumble right out of the gate. The very first thing they do after they leave Mount Sinai is start griping about their circumstances, and God sends a plague among them. They start griping about having to eat manna. God ends up giving them quail. They gripe about the lack of water, and God tells Moses, this time I want you to speak to the rock. Previously he had him strike the rock, right? But this time at Kadesh Barnea, you're to speak to the rock. And Moses, I think, is just utterly exasperated with these people who simply don't want to listen. And he strikes the rock, and he says essentially, must we bring you water out of this rock? And God said that Moses did not uphold him before the people. And as a consequence, Moses would not set foot in the land of Palestine. But the people end up getting water, and they end up sending out 12 spies, and you know the story. They only listen to the 10 who say, we're not going to be able to take this land. The cities are walled up to heaven. It's populated with giants. We're grasshoppers in comparison with them in their sight and in our own, which I think is the key there, in their own eyes. We can't do this. Joshua and Caleb say, yes, we can, but the people threaten to stone them. And so God says, fine, I've had it with you. You're going to wander in the wilderness 1 year for every day the spies were in the land, 40 years, until the carcasses of every one of this generation have fallen in the wilderness, and your children will get the land. And then they say, oh, we didn't mean that. Well, let's go take the land now. And God says, nope, too late. You had your shot and you blew it. And they say, well, let's get the ark and take off. And off they go. And the first thing they do is they get defeated because God is not with them. And so they resign themselves to wandering in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation dies in the wilderness. The children that come up in the wilderness, having grown up on hard times, are an entirely different mindset than their parents. And when they gather, this time instead of assaulting from the south in Kadesh Barnea, they come around to the east and they find themselves right on the border of Moab and Ammon on the river Arnon, and they launch their assault from the east. And this time they have an entirely different mindset. They follow Joshua into the land. They launch their assault. They successfully take the land of Canaan because God is with them. Now, they had some hiccups along the way, Ai, for example. But by and large, they succeed. And that generation is faithful as long as they live. That generation dies off, and you begin a cycle whereby the people, according to the book of Judges, begin to do that which is right in every man's own eyes. And they fall away from the Lord. They don't practice what God has told them to. God allows, in most of the cycles, some foreign enemy to come in and to give them a hard time. And they begin to suffer. They turn back to God. They ask for deliverance. God raises up a judge. The judge drives off whoever it is that's giving them a hard time. And they have a little bit of prosperity for a time, and before long they get comfortable and they repeat the cycle. This goes until Samuel is the judge, who's also a prophet. And the people say, we want a king so that we can be like the nations round about us. Samuel goes to God and says, God, they've rejected me. God says, no, Samuel, it's not you they've rejected, it's me they've rejected. But I want you to go tell them exactly what it's going to be like if they get a king. And so Samuel does, and he goes and he tells them. He says, look, you need to understand, if you get a king, this king is going to tax you. That which you work to grow in your fields and that livestock that you raise in your pastures, he's going to tax you from them. He's going to take your sons and he is going to inscript them into his armies and into his labor forces, and he's going to have them go and fight his wars for him and build his palaces for him and build roads and canals and whatever else he wants built, and he's going to force you into that kind of labor. And you're going to have to do whatever the king tells you to do, and you're going to be bound by whatever the king says. And the people said, give us a king so that we can be like the nations round about us. And so Samuel goes back to God, and God says, give them a king. Points out Saul, which is very interesting to me. And I'm going to tell you now, I've got about 60 to 80 questions on my list of 8,923 questions when I get to heaven, all about, why Saul, Lord? There's so many reasons I don't really understand that. But he does. He chooses Saul, who's a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, makes him the first king. He reigns for about 40 years. Starts off well, but it doesn't last long. Pretty soon, he gets pretty comfortable with the idea of having authority, and he falls away from the Lord. God rejects him. He rejects him over the slaughter of the Ammonites that he doesn't do correctly. Amalekites, excuse me, not Ammonites. Amalekites. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 16, he sends Samuel down to the town of Bethlehem, and there he anoints David to be the next king. David, being a man after God's own heart, establishes a rapport with God that ultimately leads in 2 Samuel chapter 7 to God making a promise to establish David's throne, essentially meaning his dynasty, and to allow that dynasty to stand until Jesus comes. And that dynasty does stand on the literal throne in the literal city of Jerusalem as long as there is a kingdom of Judah. But David's son Solomon becomes king. That is essentially the golden age of Israelite history. In terms of prosperity and power and all of those sorts of things, Solomon is the apex. He's the zenith. And after Solomon, and even during Solomon in his old age, as he begins to fall away from the Lord and follow his wives into idolatry, the Lord says, this is not the way this is supposed to go. He sends a prophet to Solomon, and he shows him that 10 of the tribes are going to be taken away, not from him, but from his son. Sure enough, when Solomon dies, Rehoboam, his son, comes to the throne, and because of his stubbornness, 10 of the tribes leave, and they form their own nation. They take a renegade whom Solomon had exiled to Egypt by the name of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. They make him their king, and he promptly changes the entire worship system. He makes priests of the lowest people of the nation. He changes the worship calendar. He sets up golden calves in Dan and Bethel, and he uses exactly the same speech that Aaron, the priest, had used when he gave a golden calf to Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai. He says, "These are thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." And he teaches them to worship them. Every king after Jeroboam that rules over the northern 10 tribes follows in that particular line of idolatry. And in fact, as you read the books of Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, as they detail the reigns of those northern kings, as each one of them dies, you'll read a little line that goes something like this: "He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, wherewith he made Israel to sin." And what he means by that is he continued the golden calf worship. Now, some of them, like Ahab, married a Phoenician princess by the name of Jezebel, and she brought with her the worship of Baal and Ashtaroth. And so they added to their idolatry an even more heinous idolatry, and that caused problems. Well, that sort of thing goes on for, in the northern 10 tribes, 9 dynasties. Until in 722 BC, the Lord has had so much of it that he's done with them, and he allows the Assyrians to come in and do something that had never been successfully done before. They laid siege to the city of Samaria and conquered it. Now, you say, why is that remarkable? Well, the interesting thing about it is, and let me pause here just a moment to throw in a commercial. If you haven't walked across the hall and seen the magnificent relief map of the land of Palestine, do it. I'm already plotting to steal the thing. I'm telling you, it's gorgeous. But the reason that that relief map is so, I think, valuable as a teaching aid is because the lay of the land in Israel is such a huge factor in the way the history of Israel plays out, that if you can see the lay of the land, you'll have about 1 million aha moments. Oh, that makes sense now why that happened the way it did. One of which is the siege of Samaria. Samaria is located in the mountainous area, and it's surrounded by mountains and valleys and little canyons and caves and all sorts of things like that. And it would be nearly impossible to muster an army big enough and strong enough for long enough to surround that city well enough that nobody could sneak in and out and bring supplies back and forth to the city to do what a siege is designed to do, which is to starve the people out, right? Or at least to hold them up until their supplies are running low and disease is running rampant and all of those sorts of things, and they give up. Well, nobody had ever done that in Samaria before, but the Assyrians did, because they had an army the likes of which the world had never seen at that point. And they conquer Samaria. They conquer the northern 10 tribes. They carry them off into captivity, but they pursue a policy of taking their captives and scattering them throughout the empire, which had the effect of destroying their identity as a people. That's why you never read about the 10 tribes returning from captivity, because they didn't maintain an identity as 10 tribes in captivity. They were scattered among all other kinds of foreigners, and they eventually just sort of blended in and assimilated with the people around about them. Okay, so they're gone. That leaves Judah. Now, Judah is made up of the tribes of Judah, Benjamin. If you look at the land grant, Simeon was actually located inside the land grant of Judah. So probably most of the Simeonites, which weren't a whole lot to begin with, had sort of assimilated with the Judeans. And then when Jeroboam had started all of this golden calf worship, most of the Levites had left the northern 10 tribes and come down to Judah to be in and around Jerusalem, where the temple was at that point, and to continue the worship of God. So you really have about 4 tribes that make up the kingdom of Judah. Okay? It continues on, but they don't learn the lessons of their sister, and they begin to, they continue to worship idols and to be unfaithful to the Lord, and to treat the covenant of Moses as a series of technicalities, as long as you kind of make the appearance of fulfilling the law, you can pretty well do what you want to. And their heart wasn't in it, and the Lord said, I've had enough. And beginning in 606 BC, and in 3 campaigns lasting over 20 years, from 606 to 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, comes in and he sacks the city of Jerusalem, and he carries most of the Jews into Babylonian captivity. Now, there was a remnant that was left behind. And a good chunk of the books of Nehemiah, of Jeremiah rather, and Lamentations will sort of fill you in on what was going on in Palestine after everybody else had been hauled over to Babylon. And you will read about, for example, one group that travels down and settles in Egypt. Okay? That's important to note for the history that there's a group of Jews that during the Babylonian captivity went and settled in Egypt, and there continued to be a Jewish settlement in Egypt pretty much from that point forward. Okay? How long had God said that the children of Israel would be in captivity in Babylon? Anybody remember? 70 years. 70 years. Okay? And it's interesting that you can count that 70 years in any of a couple of different ways. You know, if you want to count, for example, from the first onslaught on the city of Jerusalem in 606, okay, 70 years would lead you to 536. Remember, BC counts backwards, right? What happens in 536? Anybody remember? Well, King Cyrus had marched his armies into Babylon and overthrown the Babylonians, and he issues an edict in 536 that allows the Israelites to go back and rebuild Jerusalem and repopulate the land of Palestine. So if you measure from 606, the first attack on Jerusalem, to 536, which is the edict of Cyrus, 70 years. Or perhaps you want to measure from 586, which is when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, from temple to temple. And if you go and you look at the book of Ezra and you read carefully the construction of the temple and you do your math, I think you're going to find there that from 586 to 516 is the period where there was no temple. Again, 70 years. So either way you measure it, temple to temple or first attack to first release, either way, 70 years. And they go back and they begin to populate the land. Now that's the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. However, there's a significant population of Jewish people who never leave Babylon. Of course, by this time it's part and parcel of the Persian Empire. But they stay there geographically. And so there's a significant settlement of Jews to the east in the Persian Empire. There's a significant settlement of Jews to the southwest in Egypt. And then now there's this resettlement by Jews of the land of Palestine in the middle. Okay? Now, this sets up the history of the period we're going to study. Palestine is located right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, which makes it important for about a gazillion different reasons. One of which is because there are a number of port cities along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea that are important for seagoing trading, which is really, through the work of the Phoenicians, becoming a booming enterprise during about this time in history. Two, it is located along a trade route that has existed for many, many, many years from over in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, Babylon and that area, up to the north and then back down south through Palestine and over to Egypt, because trade goods have been following that route literally for centuries at this point. As a matter of fact, remember when Joseph's brothers sold him into Egyptian slavery? They sold him to a group of traders who were passing through. They were very likely traveling that exact route that had been traveled for so many years. So Palestine's located on a major ancient trade route. That also has significant importance to whoever controls it, right? Not only in terms of commerce, but in terms of taxes, in terms of political power, what have you. All right, so the Persians control this area. The Persians fall into the same trap that the Babylonians had fallen into before them, which is the same trap that the Assyrians had fallen into before them, which is to say that they overextended themselves trying to control Egypt. Nobody ever succeeded trying to control Egypt, not for very long. And it ultimately spelled the downfall of all three of the first major world empires. Okay? The Assyrians overextended themselves and ended up getting themselves into trouble trying to control Egypt. As a matter of fact, they were in the middle of a war with Egypt, and they had essentially worn themselves out and the Egyptians out on the battlefield when the Babylonians come riding into the fray and whip both of them and take over the world. And for a brief period, the Babylonians were the world empire simply because they caught both the Assyrians and the Egyptians worn out from fighting one another. And they really don't last much more than about a generation or so as a world empire, and then the Persians come in. The Persians take over. If the Persians had sort of stayed in and around Mesopotamia and east of there, they'd have been fine. But once again, they tried to overextend themselves and control Egypt. And Egypt sapped their power, sapped their political power, sapped their resources, sapped their military power, trying to keep it under control. And they end up weakening themselves. And about 330, this young man from up in Macedonia by the name of Alexander, who, by the way, had been a student of Aristotle, the philosopher, he comes to the throne of his father, and he decides that he is going to extend Greek influence as far as he can. And his first target, essentially, is Persia. And he takes them on in battle, and everybody thinks he's crazy. Who's going to beat Persia? I mean, they're the big bad on the world stage. Well, he does. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And the third time, he decisively defeats them to the point that they will never return again as an empire. Okay? He begins to extend Greek influence. He extends Greek influence successfully south as far as Egypt, and then east as far as India, and then he dies a young man in his 30s. After his death, there's a lot of intrigue, and I'm still debating as to how in depth we'll get into that intrigue and whether it's necessarily relevant. The short version is this. His empire ends up being divided among 4 generals. 2 of those are important for our purposes. You have one whose name is Ptolemy, 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 who settles in Egypt, and Seleucus, who ends up making his center of power in and around Syria. Okay? Which means one to the south of Palestine, one to the north, right? Initially, Palestine is owned and controlled by the Ptolemies. But, again, for the reasons that we've talked about, it's desirable to control Palestine. And there are battles between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, somewhat over Palestine, somewhat over other things, but guess who's caught in the middle every single time? The Jews are. I mean, here they are living in this area. They were subject to Persian rule until Alexander came along and overthrew the Persians. As soon as he overthrows the Persians, they're in absolutely no condition to have any kind of a legitimate uprising against Alexander. And as a matter of fact, they apparently pretty willingly went along with Alexander at the beginning anyway. And so they are under Greek rule. The Ptolemies, by and large, were decent to them, and so we'll see that they didn't cause a great deal of problem for the Ptolemies, but ultimately the Seleucids end up taking control of Palestine, and that's when things get really dicey. Especially when a Seleucid king by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes, comes to the throne, and we'll talk about him. He causes a whole lot of problems that ultimately leads to a civil war and an uprising that leads to the end of Seleucid control of Palestine. It also, by the way, this is Maccabees is the nickname that is given to the family that leads the revolt. And really not even so much the family as one individual, Judas Maccabeus. Anybody know what Maccabee means, by the way?
Hammer.
Heard somebody say it.
Hammer.
Hammer, yeah. Judas the Hammer. Almost sounds like a wrestler, doesn't it? Judas the Hammer. Okay. He was called the Hammer of God. Some have even suggested that he may have used an actual hammer as a weapon in war, which is not too terribly far-fetched if you think about it. It's not uncommon in the history of nations dominating other nations that one of the first things that a ruling nation does is to disarm the population. And it's also not unheard of in the history of the world for peasant people who have been domineered for a certain amount of time to take their farming implements and their tools of everyday living and use them as weapons to drive out the oppressor. So it may very well be that Judas used a hammer as a weapon. Who knows? But at any rate, he and his family lead a revolt that ultimately leads to the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty is a group of Jewish kings that rule for just about 100 years. And things look pretty good for the Jews for a little while there. Like they're going to have some level of independence. Like they may actually have something of a sovereign nation there in Palestine for a little while. Have any of you read any of the history of the Borgia family? One of them was a pope of the Roman Catholic Church, but what they're infamous for is their intrigue and their plots and assassinations and all that sort of thing. The later Hasmonean dynasty is like an early Borgia family, okay? They are plotting and they are assassinating one another and they're deposing one another, and there's all this intrigue and all this sort of stuff. I'm going to try to keep that as accessible as possible because it can get to be a tangled web if ever there was one. And if you want to compound the tangle of the web, they had this tradition that ordinarily, if you had a son, you named him after your father, which means every other generation has the same name. And it gets really confusing because you've got like Simon, Joseph, Simon, Joseph, Simon, Joseph, Simon, Joseph, and you don't know which Simon and Joseph you're talking about. Well, okay, so we're going to try to unpack some of that. Ultimately, the Hasmoneans send an engraved invitation to a fellow by the name of Pompey to come and help them in their intrigues and inner wars. Anybody know who Pompey was?
One of the greatest Roman generals.
That's right. Early on, he was Julius Caesar's sort of right-hand man, and then he became his rival. The invitation to Pompey essentially invited Roman rule in. Pompey ushered in Roman rule, then he lost to Caesar, and Caesar took advantage of the paving work that Pompey had done to pave the road for him to control Palestine. And Caesar places a man by the name of Herod in control of Palestine, or at least Lower Palestine. And that's a very, very, very simplified overview of the history that we're going to be looking at. But essentially that's where we're going to be. Now I want to be completely honest with you. From the end of the Old Testament until about the period of the Maccabees, we don't have a whole lot of this is the daily what went on in Palestine. Because really about the only source we've got is Josephus to tell us what the Jews were doing in that period. And it's not very detailed. We know they were there, but as far as the workings of daily life, we kind of have to look at this from a world history point of view and say, okay, what's going on in the greater world around them, and sort of infer the gist of what's going on with them. Beginning with the story of the Maccabees, though, we get a lot more detail, and we'll look in some more detail in that. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to step out of this world here, where you have a fledgling society trying to rebuild under the thumb of Persian authority, to down here when we get to the birth of Jesus, where you've got some guy named Herod on the throne that we don't have any idea who he is from the Old Testament, and we've got these folks named Pharisees and these folks called Sadducees, and we've got chief priests and scribes and all of these people that we're going, well, we read a little bit about scribes because Ezra was one, but what is all of this? It's an entirely different world in Matthew than the one we leave in Malachi. And so we're going to try to bridge that gap in our study together. Questions, comments? I'm looking forward to studying this with you. I hope you are as well. Thank you so much for your attention.